Hey everybody. This is a piece uh, by Paul Levi. It's titled, it's the introduction to Rosa Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution. So let's check it out. Here we are. Preface. This, by the way, this is from In the Steps of Rosa Luxemburg. Selected writings of Paul Levi. I've been calling him Levi for a while, but when I just typed in to Google Translate, this is what it told me to pronounce. Paul Levi is how that made it sound.
Paul Levi. Paul Levi.
Paul Levi. So here we go. Where the hell am I? All right, preface. I believe that I am right in every respect to publish this pamphlet. This pamphlet's origins are as follows. In the summer of 1918, Rosa Luxemburg sent the Spartacus Briefe articles from her prison in Breslau, in which she took critical issue with the policies of the Bolsheviks. This is the period after Brest-Litovsk, the time of the Zusatzverträge. Footnote. Bracket supplementary treaties, end bracket, that the Soviet government was compelled to sign on the 27th of August 1918, recognize effective German suzerainty over Finland, Ukraine, and Georgia. The collapse of the German army less than 2 months later put paid to those treaties. Let's see. Let me see if there's anything good German Wikipedia for this, because this seems important. Motherfucker. Alright, come on. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for it. Okay. Anyway, back to the text. And footnote. Rosa Luxemburg's friends saw their publication as inopportune at that time, and I agreed with them. Since Rosa Luxemburg stubbornly insisted on their publication, I traveled to see her in Breslau in September 1918, where, after long and detailed discussion in the prison, though I did not convince Rosa Luxemburg agreed to refrain from publishing a recently written article against Bolshevik tactics. In order to convince me of the correctness of Rosa Luxemburg's criticism, Rosa Luxemburg wrote the following pamphlet. Rosa Luxemburg informed me of the broad lines of its content from prison by way of a trusted woman friend. Footnote. Matilda Jacob. Wikipedia says, Matilda Jacob lived from 1873 to 1943 and was a German typist and translator during the First World War, who, during the First World War, became politically involved, working with the anti-war Spartacus League, and as a founder member of the German Communist Party. Matilda Jacob came to politics through her work for Rosa Luxemburg, whose friend and close confidant Matilda Jacob became. Although Matilda Jacob continued to be politically engaged in the 1920s, Matilda Jacob's greater contribution to history comes from her having smuggled Rosa Luxemburg's letters and documents out of Luxemburg's prison cell during her friend's various incarcerations during the 1914 to 1918 war. Matilda Jacob then preserved much of Luxemburg's written legacy after Rosa Luxemburg's murder. By the time the Nazis took power in early 1933, Matilda Jacob had for most purposes retired into obscurity, but Matilda Jacob's personal history of communist activism and her Jewishness nevertheless made Matilda Jacob vulnerable. It is thought that Matilda Jacob attempted to escape from Germany in 1936, but without success. In 1939, Matilda Jacob did succeed in transferring some of the letters written to and by Rosa Luxemburg to the United States. Methode Jacob died in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, having been arrested and deported at the end of July 1942. Following Methode Jacob's death, the authorities attending to her confiscated assets recorded a claim from her landlord that she was liable to pay for some repairs on an apartment, noting that rent on the property had not been received for 3 months. Okay, so that's Methode Jacob. Back to the text. And footnote, Rosa Luxemburg informed me of its content from prison by way of a trusted woman friend, Methode Jacob, remarking that Rosa was busily working at work writing a detailed critique of what had happened in Russia. Quote, "I am writing this pamphlet for you," end quote. Rosa Luxemburg added, quote, "and if I convince only you, I shall not have done this work in vain," end quote. As material for the pamphlet, Luxemburg used not only German newspapers, but all the Russian newspapers and pamphlets that had reached Germany through the Russian embassy and that trusted friends had smuggled in to Rosa in prison. I expect 2 reproaches from some people that I am publishing it only now, and from others that I am publishing it already. Indeed, publishing it at all, the pamphlet was indeed condemned to the flames by a certain party, end parenthesis. Footnote, bracket, according to Clara Setkin, who devoted a short book to rebutting the content of Luxemburg's pamphlet, Leo Yogishus advised her after Luxemburg's death to burn the manuscript, though Zetkin makes clear that this was not from unwillingness to offend the Bolsheviks, but because Luxemburg had not had access to sufficient material in prison and intended, in due course, to write a fuller critique of Bolshevik policy. The accusation was also made that Levi, in reproducing a copy of Luxemburg's text, had not accurately published her original manuscript, which had not yet been found. In the event, when this eventually reappeared in 1929, it turned out to be only marginally different from the version Levi published, end bracket. End footnote. As material, End footnote. As for the timing of publication, it goes without saying that this was independent of differences that I have had with the Bolsheviks on a well-known occasion. In my view, the timing is firstly determined by the fact that the rule of the Bolsheviks in Russia is more secure now than at any previous time, and as secure as it can be so long as the Western proletariat does not relieve Russia from Russia's isolation. And secondly, it is determined by the fact that the present Bolshevik policy involves the most serious consequence for the European workers' movement, and that everything must be done to promote independent criticism of Russian developments. Only those who think critically are able to separate truth from lies, the permanent from the accidental, the gemstone from the rubble. This publication, therefore, seems to me both possible and urgent. Rotofana will cry, quote, "Anti-Bolshevism." That is something I cannot prevent. It is up to Rotofana's editors. As is already apparent, the pamphlet is not complete. There are certain passages where the trains of ideas is sketched only lightly, though still clearly. I would have liked to have added a faithful development of this summary, but have refrained from this so as not to leave room for any misunderstandings. There are just a few quotations that in the manuscript were given only by headwords and that I have inserted literally here, as the author intended by leaving space for them. In my introduction, I have preferred to cite almost exclusively Lenin or Trotsky. I fear that this could give the impression that my intention is to, quote, chafe Lenin. Nothing could be further from my mind. I've basically cited Lenin because the Russian Revolution and the Russian Revolution's works should be judged after the great men who lead it rather than the scribblers, neither its Narcissus nor its Thersites, or Thersites. Paul Levy, Frankfurt am Main, 14th of November, 1921. Here's the introduction. Quote, "It is glorious to be even a complaint on the lips of the beloved, ... End quote. Schiller, Nenny. Section 1. There can be no doubt that the world working class finds the world working class itself in a serious crisis, and it would be superficial to see this crisis as simply that. Here and there among the workers differences of opinion have arisen, which at a party level confront one another in desirable or undesirable forms. That would not in itself be bad, and would not be felt by the working class as a crisis, if there were not a real crisis as well. The working class the world over emerged from the war in a state of extreme distress. It had sacrificed its sons and brothers by the million, and this was its reward. Millions upon millions of unemployed, depressed wages, the collapse of even the paltry shelter that the proletariat of the capitalist world possessed before the war. A development such as we see today is certainly unprecedented in history, not like the case of the Roman proletariat, who over a number of generations fell from the level of dignified life to the depths of the sewer, but that in a handful of years, 5 at the most, a change occurred that could only make the time before the war seem like a paradise. This was not Adam expelled from paradise to live on the earth, but millions who at least lived on the earth as best they could, who are now driven under the ground. Is it any wonder, then, that millions are now set on socialism, that they expect from it a miracle that no one can provide? But is it any wonder, too, if now, precisely in this situation, when socialism cannot give the hungry bread from one day to the next, cannot give the thirsty wine, and when only the clearest and most open speech can open the eyes and ears of the proletariat to what the proletariat's own task is, it is doubly hard for them to see disappointment precisely where they formerly believed that the boldest step towards socialism had been taken. We should not conceal any of this from ourselves. If today in the West we learn of speeches by Lenin, decrees of the Council of the People's Commissars, in which the masses see not the road to communism, but rather the road to capitalism, and no speeches or addresses can help this, it is no wonder that the editors of the communist papers or the central leadership of communist parties are in despair. These are things that are not simply settled by the editors of Vorwärts, making spiteful remarks or acting as clever dicks. Quote, it's actually what it says, clever dicks. I don't know if that has the same meaning in Germany, but it's fucking funny. These are things that are not simply settled by the editors of Vorwärts making spiteful remarks or acting as clever dicks. Quote, "We always told you so," end quote. They are processes that shake the whole working class very deeply, from social democrats to communists, and do not trigger feelings of triumph anywhere, but rather a dull feeling of doubt, not about the correctness of the communist policy in Russia, but about socialism in general. Take the German working class, for example. In one direction, the German working class see the social democrats joining up with the Stinnes, quote, "forward to capitalism," end quote. I think Stinnes is an important industrialist in Germany. Footnote, bracket, the industrialist and conservative politician Hugo Stinnes, who pioneered, quote, "cooperation between trade unions and employers at this time," end bracket, end footnote. And on the other side, the German working class see the communist, who previously identified themselves with every stroke of Soviet Russian policy, but now find Lenin also saying, quote, forward to capitalism, end quote. The two antipodes of the workers' movement are united under the same battle cry. We fear that the Russian communists have not completely recognized the whole ominous tragedy that their latest policy contains for the whole world. The Soviet government has committed itself in a note to the government of the Entente to pay the Russian debts from the Tsarist war and prevent. The Soviet government has committed itself in a note to the governments of the Entente to pay the Russian debts from the Tsarist war and pre-war period. It may be, we are unable to judge, that the position of the Russian state requires this, and we also need not mention several billions in treasure, which perhaps means that the Russian national economy is not so poor, and the Anglo-French not so rich. But we do need to speak of the moral asset that the international working class loses when the international working class sees the decline of a visible sign of resistance against all-powerful capitalism. For the fact is that the Russian Soviet Republic, scoffed and scorned by some, loved and praised by others, was, at all events, perceived by all proletarians as the first heroic assault against the citadel of capitalism. Its existence was for everyone a living sign that the existing powers of capitalism are not eternal. It was for all proletarians the first attempt to shape the world in a proletarian sense. And it was, therefore, the greatest moral factor that the world workers' movement had ever possessed. We who believed that we had to place our weak forces on the side of the Russian Revolution from the Russian Revolution's very first day, believe that we can now also say without ambiguity, we see the eternal achievement of the Bolsheviks in the fact that the Bolsheviks strove to be this from the first days of the Russian Revolution. Their greatness is not just that, from the first day, the Bolsheviks secured the achievements of the revolution that made possible the development of social forces in Russia by placing at the head of the revolution the one class whose aims lie in the future, that they secured their present victory by struggling for a future still to be attained. It was rather that, with a Faustian drive, the Bolsheviks pointed into the distance, pointed beyond the present world, and showed how all their work was only partial so long as the forces of the world proletariat did not help to support it. Quote, my field is the world, end quote, was their motto from the first day. It is true that the proletarians of the world did not come to the aid of the Russian Revolution either as rapidly as some expected or in the way that some thought, but as an arousal, a call, as a magnet for the proletarian forces of the whole world, Soviet Russia exerted a power greater than anything previous. By proclaiming in Russia and hence to the world, quote, for the first time the final goals of socialism as the immediate program of practical policy, end quote. I don't know if I said the first quote. Quote, for the first time the final goals of socialism as the immediate program of practical policy, end quote. And in this way, as the historical task demanded, basing its whole policy on the whole world proletariat and its revolutionary arousal, by fearlessly choosing the steepest path in life without bending the knee, and with unshakable resilience directing all thoughts to the victory of the proletariat. The Bolsheviks will remain unforgotten by the proletariat into the furthest future. They will, quote, be imperishable and shine, end quote. This task, however, with history entrusted to them and which they themselves are not happy to undertake, lays special responsibility on the Bolsheviks, not only towards the Russian proletariat, but also to that of the world. Their actions are subject to criticism, and they should be so both in Russia and abroad. As to the stability of the measures with which the Bolsheviks refuse this criticism in Russia, we shall later say a few words, and Rosa Luxemburg already expressed herself on this. But insofar as the Soviet Russian Republic is unable to do is unable to, do prevent, but insofar as the Soviet Russian Republic is unable to, do prevent this criticism by force, it does so by defaming any difference of opinion as, quote, opportunism or, quote, Menshevism. I think there might have been a typo in that sentence, or I read it wrong. Rosa Luxemburg quite unambiguously distanced herself from, quote, Menshevism in her text, but an outcome emerged all the same that Luxemburg already suspected in her judgment on the policy of the Bolsheviks at that time. We do not delude ourselves that the same slogans will not also be used against the present text. But this cannot prevent us from what we see as necessary, all the less so in that the frequent use of these words has certainly made them no more dangerous, and that we have the conviction grounded on facts that not too many of those who have the word, quote, Menshevik on their tongues connect it with a corresponding idea. All the less can we be stayed when precisely the crisis in which the workers of the world find themselves today demands that we take a critical distance from events in Russia. Only if we take the trouble to find out whether there are things wrong in Russia and what these things may be, where the sources of the mistakes lie, will we be able to show the masses that, despite this, the way to socialism is the only way that leads to their deliverance. We hope that, in this way, we shall keep and win thousands for socialism who will otherwise be lost. Criticism of Russia practiced today is balm for the proletariat movement. And, even if this criticism goes too far here and there, we hope this is not the case in the following lines. Those at whom this criticism is aimed should value it in the words of Frau Funz in her last letter to her children, quote, if you had loved me less, you would condemn me less now, end quote. Footnote, bracket, the heroine of a popular story by late 19th century writer Jens Peter Jakobsen. Wikipedia says Jens Peter Jakobsen lived from 1847 to 1885 and is a Danish novelist, poet, and scientist, in Denmark often just written as J.P. Jakobsen. Jens Peter Jakobsen began the naturalist movement in Danish literature and was part of the modern breakthrough. Okay. Back to the text. New section. Section 2. Since February 1921, the policy of the Bolsheviks has undergone a complete reversal. Footnote, bracket, following the Kronstadt revolt in the 10th Party Congress, the Soviet government took the turn that came to be known as the New Economic Policy, end bracket. End footnote. Concession after concession, compromise after compromise, we believe we cannot be reproached as people who saw communism as something built in the radiant blue of the sky, presented to the proletariat of any country of the world like a Christmas gift, with the alternative, quote, this or nothing, end quote. Compromises are something that cannot be avoided. It would not be revolutionary to forget compromise. To harness the powers of the proletariat to what is possible, no more than to praise to the grieving people the compromises made by, quote, princes, parliamentarians, ministers, as the work of a higher dispensation. A compromise that is uncompromising thus has two preconditions. One of them is that the nature of the compromise is not concealed but openly denounced as being weak and half-hearted. The other is that beyond the compromise, the goal to be pursued by the masses is kept before the masses' eyes. Are the measures taken by the Bolsheviks since February of this year compromises? There has not yet been any unambiguous declaration about this, and it is advisable, therefore, to compare these measures with the original intentions of the Bolsheviks. We have already mentioned above how Rosa Luxemburg described the task of the Bolsheviks as necessarily self-imposed. Lenin himself previously defined this task as follows, quote, "That is why we are faced with a new and higher form of struggle against the bourgeoisie, the transition from the very simple task of further expropriating the capitalists to the much more complicated and difficult task of creating conditions in which it will be impossible for the bourgeoisie to exist." End quote. Lenin, the immediate tasks of the Soviet government. We need only compare this description by Lenin of the task in January 1918 with what is contained in his recent statements. Quote, "While the revolution in Germany is still slow in, quote, coming forth, our task is to study the state capitalism of the Germans, to spare no effort in copying the state capitalism of the Germans, and not shrink from adopting dictatorial methods to hasten the copying of Western culture by barbarian Russia, without hesitating to use barbarous methods for fighting barbarism, ... One way is to try to prohibit entirely, to put the lock on all development of private non-state exchange, i.e. trade, i.e. capitalism, which is inevitable with millions of small producers. But such a policy would be foolish and suicidal for the party that tried to apply it, ... Inasmuch as we are as yet unable to pass directly from small production to socialism, some capitalism is inevitable as the elemental product of small production and exchange, so that we must utilize capitalism, particularly by directing capitalism into the channels of state capitalism, as the intermediary link between small production and socialism, as a means, a path, and a method of increasing the productive forces." End quote. Lenin, The Tax in Kind. I do not believe that we need to add to this first quotation any reminiscences from Russian history. There are people who spoke in this vein without having gone through the Marxian school. I rather believe that this comparison, which can be extended further if you like, is sufficient for the purpose we have set ourselves here, to show, that is, that the goal of the Bolsheviks in 1918 was to create conditions in which capitalism could no longer exist and in which it could no longer return to life, whereas in 1921, the goal of the Bolsheviks was to create conditions in which capitalism, as state capitalism if possible, and if not, then as private capitalism of the common and garden kind, could make a return. There is one thing, however, that we can admit right away. Nothing at all is proved by this kind of comparison. What goals it is really revolutionary to pursue never result from a more or less, quote, radical conception. Only primitive communists of the kind of Bellakun and Bellakun's German followers, unless they have since unlearned this, say general insurrection and anything less is evil. In reality, the revolutionary or counter-revolutionary character of any goal does not result from the words used, but rather from their historical context. Those who in Prussia in 1910, for example, demanded mass demonstrations with the aim of, quote, universal suffrage, were far more revolutionary than it would have been to demand, quote, on top of this, end quote, workers' and soldiers' councils. So, too, from these different goals proclaimed by the Bolsheviks in 1918 and 1921, we cannot directly draw conclusions, but must, rather, go back to the historical context out of which these goals arose. New section, Section 3. Lenin seeks as follows to make the concessions to capitalism palatable. Quote, "The concessionaire is a capitalist. The concessionaire conducts his business on capitalist lines for profit and is willing to enter into an agreement with the proletarian government in order to obtain super profits or raw materials which the concessionaire cannot otherwise obtain, or can obtain only with great difficulty. Soviet power gains by the development of the productive forces and by securing an increased quantity of goods immediately, or within a very short period. End quote. Lenin, The Tax in Kind. It is completely understandable, though perhaps not completely accurate, for a communist writer to present the process in this way. How would a protagonist of capitalism present the process? In exactly the same words, but the other way round. Quote, Soviet power, he would say, quote, is a power unable to develop the productive forces, not immediately and not in a sufficiently short time. The capitalist takes advantage of this. He enters into an agreement with the proletarian power in order to obtain extraordinarily high profits, etc. End quote. No one will contest the fact that the two sides are both right, and that the capitalist does not need to give any explanation of his view of things, for his very nature always demands extraordinarily high profits, whereas the communist presentation of the matter needs explanation. What then was the development on the basis of which the Bolsheviks came to set themselves this capitalist goal, in contrast to the socialist goal of 1918? We shall let Lenin speak for himself. Quote, First, with the whole of the peasants against the monarchy, against the landowners, against medievalism, and to that extent the revolution remains bourgeois democratic, Then, with the poor peasants, with the semi-proletarians, with all the exploited, against capitalism, including the rural rich, the kulaks, the profiteers, and to that extent the revolution becomes a socialist revolution. We carried the bourgeois revolution to the bourgeois revolution's conclusion. The peasants supported us as a whole. The peasants' antagonism to the socialist proletariat could not reveal itself all at once. The Soviets united the peasants in general. The class divisions among the peasants had not yet matured, had not yet come into the open. That process took place in the summer and autumn of 1918. The Czech counter-revolutionary mutiny aroused the kulaks. A wave of kulak revolts swept over Russia. The poor peasants learned, not from books or newspapers, but from life itself, that the poor peasants' interests were irreconcilably antagonistic to those of the kulaks, the rich, the rural bourgeoisie. Like every other petty bourgeois party, the quote, left socialist revolutionaries, end quote, reflected the vacillation of the people, and in the summer of 1918 they split. One section joined forces with the Czechs, the rebellion in Moscow, then Prussian, having seized the telegraph office, seized the telegraph office for 1 hour, announced to Russia that the Bolsheviks had been overthrown. Then the treachery of Muriavov, commander-in-chief of the army that was fighting the Czechs, while the other section that mentioned above remained with the Bolsheviks. End quote. Lenin. One second. Footnote. The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky by Lenin. And Lenin expressed his ideas elsewhere in still more sharp, concise, and precise terms. Quote, the proletariat must separate, demarcate the working peasant from the peasant owner, the peasant worker from the peasant huckster, the peasant who labors from the peasant who profiteers. In this demarcation lies the whole essence of socialism. End quote. Lenin, Economics and Politics in the Era of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. End footnote. This is a point that Rosa Luxemburg already dealt with in her critique. One thing, of course, must be made clear. In one respect, Rosa Luxemburg has been disproved. The Russian muzhik, which is, I think, male peasant, once the distribution of land has taken place, did not crawl behind his stove and let the republic be a republic and the revolution a revolution. When the revolution was threatened, the revolution that had given him, the peasant, land, the Russian peasants stood up and defended it no less heroically than the French peasant of 1793 defended his. To this extent, therefore, he proved to be a useful support of the Soviet Republic. Indeed, he even went so far in his courage that in passing, he also corrected another mistake that Rosa Luxemburg noted in the policy of the Bolsheviks. He finished with the, quote, self-determination of nations, end quote, insofar as it was a useful means of attack against the peasants' revolutionary gains. On one other point as well, history has criticized Rosa Luxemburg's criticism. Luxemburg feared a, quote, chaotic, purely arbitrary, end quote, she feared a, quote, chaotic, purely arbitrary kind, end quote, of land distribution on two grounds. First, the sharpening of class contradictions within the peasantry instead of their equalization in the direction of socialism, and along with this, the sharpening of the contradiction between peasantry and industrial proletariat. On both points, the Bolsheviks, on the basis of the possibility offered by their chosen resolution of the land question, were in a position that they hoped for the first, which Rosa Luxemburg feared, so that they could deal with the second by means of the first. History decided between this fear and hope. Here is what Lenin says on this subject. Quote, the middle stratum of the peasantry is now far more numerous and decisive than previously. The contradictions have attenuated, and by distribution the utilization of the land has become more equal. The rich peasants have forfeited their predominant position and have been largely expropriated. In Russia, more than in the Ukraine, and to a lesser extent in Siberia, but by and large, statistics show us quite beyond doubt that the village has been leveled. In other words, the sharp antagonism between rich peasants and resourceless small peasants has been adjusted. Everything has become more equal. We have now, by and large, to deal with a middle peasantry. End quote. Lenin. It is not a burning question today, therefore, to decide what was correct from a socialist point of view, the hope or the fear, for the fact on which both fear and hope were based has disappeared. The Bolsheviks' calculation, which counted on and hoped for a continuing and rapidly intensifying class antagonism within the peasantry, so that from this burning struggle the power could be drawn to continue the revolution in the direction of socialism, the calculation went awry. The distribution of land led to a leveling of class contradictions on the land. Where formerly kulaks and muzhiks, big peasants and village proletarians, confronted one another, there is now, quote, by and large, a middle peasantry, end quote. Which means that the resolution of the first contradiction, the village proletarians against rich peasants, does not resolve the second, peasants against industrial workers. Quite the contrary. Where the industrial proletarian, 3 years ago could still find understanding and help in the countryside, today the industrial proletarian finds the broad and unitary stratum of middle peasants with their hereditary ownership psychology, parenthesis, even if they formerly had nothing to apply this to, end parenthesis, and their holy terror against anything touching their recently acquired property, whether the touching comes from Lenin or Denikin. At night they see all cats as gray. This means, in other words, the contradiction between industrial proletarians and owners of lands has infinitely deepened. The common factor that bound the urban and rural proletarians together has gone, and what remains is only the will to possession, on the one hand, and the will to socialism on the other. Do the strivings of the Russian peasantry today contain even a single socialist feature? A feature that would facilitate and support the continuation of the Russian Revolution to the Russian Revolution's socialist goal. Lenin himself judged this peasantry correctly when Lenin wrote, quote, "Peasant farming continues to be petty commodity production. Here we have an extremely broad and very sound, deep-rooted basis for capitalism, a basis on which capitalism persists or arises anew in a bitter struggle against communism. The forms of this struggle are private speculation and profiteering versus state procurement of grain, parenthesis, and other products, in parenthesis, and state distribution of products in general." Lenin, Economics and Politics in the Era of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. This characterization of the peasantry, i.e. the stratum of the peasantry in Russia today, this characterization of the peasantry, i.e. the stratum of the peasantry in Russia today, is completely correct. It's just not quite comprehensive. The peasantry is not the only basis of operations of capitalism against Russian communism. There are others in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in Warsaw, etc. Nor are speculation and profiteering the only measures that are conducted on this basis. Speculation and profiteering are burdensome and dangerous weapons that the peasants possess, but they are not deadly. The peasants in Russia, as generally in every country with a preponderant peasant stratum, possess something more dangerous. One weapon acts as a hammer and the other as a hydraulic press. One strikes immediately, the other is slow but certain in its effects. The second weapon is the withdrawal of the peasant and peasant production from the market. This is the condition that Rosa Luxemburg describes with the words, quote, "It condemns the revolution to the revolution's enemies, the state to decay, the urban population to hunger," end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. The peasant withdraws like a snail into household economy. And this is why it's limited to say that peasant households are petty commodity producers. If the peasant actually is able to withdraw into the small household economy, he is not market dependent. And I think that, like, some people would say that, maybe I'm wrong, I'm misremembering his essay, but I think, for instance, John Eric Moreau, or Merritt, wrote argues that, the peasant agriculture was fundamentally pre-capitalist, and, that peasants were not market dependent in any substantial sense. The peasant withdraws like a snail into household economy. In the long run, a state that has big cities with industry and an urban proletariat cannot withstand this pressure. The hammer, however, that the Russian peasants hold in their hands is insurrection. The peasants have learned in several wars to defend an encroachment on the peasants' property by armed uprising. We believe that the effects of these two methods was threatening when the Bolsheviks decided on the radical change in their policy early in 1921. And with this fact, we return to answering the question that we raised initially. Was the Bolshevik aim in 1918 or in 1921 the revolutionary aim? Not in words, but in its historical context. Revolution in the sense of, quote, lying in the direction of the underlying preconditions for a later socialist reform, end quote. And here there can be no further doubt as to the answer. In their historical context, in their tendency, objectively, these measures of the Bolsheviks against, or rather taken towards, the peasantry are not revolutionary but counter-revolutionary, taken for the benefit of a class that has dissolved all ties with its armed comrades of 1918, which is unitedly, determinedly, unshakably anti-socialist and counter-revolutionary. It was not otherwise that Lenin judged those strivings that, just like the Kronstadt rebels, came to light under the slogan of free trade. Quote, here the petty bourgeois democratic element broke through the slogans of free trade that were directed against the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. In this way, Lenin deals also with objections that were raised against these contentions from another source. Quote, Spectator says in a polemic against Otto Bauer, quote, has he, Bauer, recommended, for example, the socialization of small or medium-sized businesses or the nationalization of trade? Not at all. Why then, if the Soviet government refrains from socializing these, does this mean right away a return to capitalism? End quote. Spectator. The answer is not difficult, according to what has been said above, the relativity of the value of political measures. There are many measures that can be taken, or goals set, which are a minus in relation to the socialization of trade, and yet are revolutionary, i.e. lie in the direction of the socialist final goal. A measure enforced by capitalist forces, the peasants, which abolishes a previous, possibly premature revolutionary measure, is not a step in the direction of socialism, but rather one in the direction of capitalism. Section 4, quote, but we have maintained the rule of the working class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. This is indeed the objection with which all those largely uncontested contentions are supposedly paralyzed. It is also the point at which the communist is presently distinguished from the, quote, Menshevik. These characteristics of differentiation are not permanently fixed. The, quote, loyal opposition from the, quote, other side, end quote. We believe, therefore, that particular care has to be devoted to this argument. We believe that we get to the core of the dispute if we bring in the following explanations of Lenin. Lenin starts by quoting literally the following sentences from Kautsky, quote, the term, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, hence not the dictatorship of a single individual but of a class, ipso facto precludes the possibility that Marx in this connection had in mind a dictatorship in the literal sense of the term. Marx speaks here not of a form of government but of a condition which must necessarily arise wherever the proletariat has gained political power. That Marx in this case did not have in mind a form of government is proved by the fact that he was of the opinion that in Britain and America the transition might take place peacefully, i.e. in a democratic way, end quote. Kautsky. Against this, Lenin gives the following definition of the concept of dictatorship, quote, dictatorship is rule based directly on force and unrestricted by any laws. The revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is rule won and maintained by the use of violence by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, rule that is unrestricted by any laws, end quote. Lenin. Lenin then adds the following explanation to this definition, quote, Kautsky finds it necessary to interpret dictatorship as a, quote, condition of domination, end quote, because then revolutionary violence and violent revolution disappear. The, quote, condition of domination is a condition in which any majority finds itself under ... quote, democracy, exclamation point. Thanks to such a fraud, revolution happily disappears, exclamation point, ... It is patently absurd to draw a distinction between a, quote, condition and a, quote, form of government. To speak of forms of government in this connection is trebly stupid, for every schoolboy knows that monarchy and republic are two different forms of government. It must be explained to Mr. Kautsky that both these forms of government, like all transitional, quote, forms of government, end quote, under capitalism, are only variations of the bourgeois state, that is, of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Lastly, to speak of forms of government is not only stupid, but also a very crude falsification of Marx. He was very clearly speaking here of this or that type of state, and not of forms of government. The proletarian revolution is impossible without the forcible destruction of the bourgeois state machine and the substitution of a new state machine, which, in the words of Engels, is, quote, no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, end quote. End quote. Lenin, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. After comparing one view against another in this way, I believe it is possible to say the following. The whole weakness and untenability of Kautsky's definition of the concept of dictatorship and the correctness of Lenin's criticism of it spring to the eye, for history does not take place in, quote, conditions. Certainly, the, quote, conditions created by the development of the economy, i.e. social stratification and stabilizations, always receive a certain kind of visible expression. But what is historically and politically decisive is the act by which a change of condition becomes visible as distinct from the previous one. Quote, conditions are always changing beneath the cover of the state, the cover of the form of government. We ourselves are witness to how far they can depart from their point of origin and come into contradictions with the by and large rigid, quote, form of government, end quote, yet without the contradictions becoming flagrant. So long as social forces do not tear apart the, quote, conditions, this cover, they are no more to the politician than the hares not yet caught in art to the hunter. And so, Kautsky's theory contains the great danger that it directs attention from the stage of political action into the wide realm of, quote, philosophy of condition, end quote, a social philosophical contemplation, a land of sky blue tranquility. Politically, this amounts to a softening of the bones. If we now turn to Lenin's commentary, and particularly Lenin's definitions, we can note right away a characteristic that is typical of many of Lenin's statements. They are somewhat reminiscent of Heraclitus, the, quote, obscure of Ephesus, and it is not always easy to establish what in fact he means. It belongs to the very essence of Lenin that he should bridle the horse precisely on the opposite side from Kautsky and begin with what is historically, and politically decisive, i.e. the visibility and organizational form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in this connection, Lenin makes a distinction that, I believe, gives a very deep insight into his train of thought. Lenin distinguishes, and this very distinction is pertinent, between, quote, form of government and, quote, form of state, end quote. The form of government, for Lenin, is something of a subordinate importance. Monarchy and republic are simply a different garb for the same essence, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. It is different with the form of state. The task of the revolution is to shatter the bourgeois state machinery and put the proletarian form of state in place of the bourgeois form of state. To this extent, I believe, all revolutionaries will agree with Lenin. The only question, however, is this, quote, this is not a quote, this is in italics, so I'm going to read it twice. Is there a form of proletarian state that secures the rule of the proletariat by its very existence, or is a change possible under the cover of the proletarian form of state, of such a kind that it is no longer proletarian, but other forces that become decisive? It's actually a very good sentence. Is there a form of proletarian state that secures the rule of the proletariat by its very existence, or is a change possible under the cover of the proletarian form of the state of such a kind that it is no longer proletarian, but other forces that become decisive? And this is going to be an important question that's a very important question that's being asked very early on about the Russian question. A very important aspect. Because formally, there's no difference. There's no official moment when you could say that the Stalinist state wasn't the same state as October that was established in October 1917. Indeed, this is the whole premise of the degenerated worker state thesis, right? That it's still Stalinism is still a degenerated byproduct of the Russian Revolution. Can this state, can this state that started, at least ostensibly as a proletarian state, become a non-proletarian state without such a revolution? I think that's kind of what the question's being asked here. Lenin himself, as far as I know, never posed this question so sharply and did not answer with this acuteness. So it's not a question of equating Lenin's view right away with the first alternative, although on the basis of his polemic with Kautsky, this may well be the case, but we can only try to show how in fact his whole conception of the Soviet state and the Soviet state's significance derives from the first formulation. What is Soviet power? We can select three of the various definitions that Lenin gave of it in his published works. 1, quote, Soviet power is nothing but an organizational form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the advanced class, which raises to a new democracy and to independent participation in the administration of the state tens upon tens of millions of working and exploited peoples who by their own experience learn to regard the disciplined and class-conscious vanguard, avant-garde of the proletariat as their most reliable leader, end quote. Lenin, the immediate tasks of the Soviet government. 2, quote, the Soviet government is the first in the world, parenthesis, or strictly speaking, the second because the Paris Commune began to do the same thing, in parenthesis, to enlist the people, specifically the exploited people in the work of administration. End quote. Lenin. The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. 3. 8 lines further on, Lenin writes, quote, the Soviets are the direct organization of the working and exploited people themselves, which helps the working and exploited people to organize and administer their own state in every possible way. And in this, it is the vanguard of the working and exploited people, the urban proletariat, that enjoys the advantage of being best united by the large enterprises. It is easier for it than for all others to elect and exercise control over the elected. The Soviet form of organization automatically helps to unite all the working people and exploited people around their vanguard, the proletariat, end quote. Lenin, the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. 1 point first of all, in these definitions, as in countless others, there are 3 levels to distinguish. 1, the mass of the exploited and the oppressed, i.e. the mass of industrial proletarians, and, parenthesis, at that time, in parenthesis, peasants. 2, the front rank, bracket, Vortrupp, end bracket, of the mass of exploited and oppressed, i.e. the urban industrial proletariat. 3, the advanced detachment, bracket, Vorhut, end bracket, of the industrial proletariat, i.e. the communists. Footnote. The German editions of Lenin that Levi cites here use both avant-garde and fortrup to translate the Russian something in Russian, depending on context, whereas English translations stick to the one word, quote, vanguard. But Levi is true to Lenin in making a conceptual distinction between the vanguard of the mass of the exploited, parenthesis, i.e. the industrial proletariat, in parenthesis, and the party of the proletariat. Vorhut, which Levi prefers to the rather artistic-sounding avant-garde, is the standard military term, parenthesis, Clausewitz, and parenthesis, for a small unit that goes ahead to scout or occupy a key position, the less well-defined Vortrupp being the front rank of the main force, end bracket. End footnote. This basic separation, which is maintained throughout Bolshevik literature, has the result that each of these three levels has its own circle of tasks, and that it is an essential task to maintain the connection between these three circles. As far as the circle of tasks is concerned, what results from the passages quoted above, which could be increased at will, is the following. 1. The task of the advanced detachment, i.e. the communist, is by discipline and consciousness of the goal to show themselves the most reliable leaders of the proletariat. 2. The task of the front rank, i.e. the industrial proletariat, is to establish technically the apparatus of the proletarian state, to maintain and control it, i.e. what Lenin expresses incompletely in the words, quote, to elect and exercise control over the elected, end quote. 3. The task of the broad mass of oppressed is, and here Lenin's terminology notably vacillates, quote, to be enlisted in the work of administration, end quote, or to, quote, learn by their own experience to regard the disciplined and class-conscious vanguard of the proletariat as their most reliable leader, end quote. By simply listing these three different stages and circles of tasks, we can turn immediately to the second question: what connection can and does exist between these circles? And this point, I believe, there has been among the Bolsheviks only a single point of view since the start of the Russian Revolution. One second. Lenin says at the place just cited, quote, the Soviet form of organization automatically helps to unite all the working and exploited people around their vanguard, the proletariat, end quote. Lenin. And Trotsky writes, quote, the revolutionary masses found their direct representation in the most simple and generally comprehensive delegate organization in the Soviet ... The Soviet embraces workers of all undertakings, of all professions, of all stages of cultural development, all stages of political consciousness, and thereby objectively is forced to formulate the general interest of the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky. The means of connection is thus the Soviet, and yet there is a difference between Lenin's formulation and Trotsky's. While Trotsky sees the advantage of the Soviets, even the Soviets' essence, in the fact that the Soviets are comprehensive, a totality for Lenin. They are a means that, quote, offers the masses the possibility, end quote, that, quote, enlists the masses. For Trotsky, therefore, according to this definition, the essence of the Soviets is destroyed if they lose their totality. Lenin speaks only of the, quote, possibility of participation. Doubtless Lenin has before his mind a case in which the masses make no use of this possibility, and yet the Soviet system still functions. For Lenin, the proletariat clearly breaks down into two sharply separated parts, one part that, quote, enlists, and the other part that is, quote, enlisted. And the connection between these two parts, as shown by the image of enlistment, or the very frequently used image of the, quote, lever, is taken from the realm of mechanics. For Lenin, both parts of a separated existence are possible. The advanced detachment of the proletariat, which establishes the Soviet system and is its bearer, can live and exist and carry the Soviet system forward until the great mass of those offered a, quote, possibility make use of it, having, quote, learned by experience, end quote, to see in them, quote, their most reliable leaders, end quote. The broad layers of exploited and oppressed, the majority and the rear guard, the object to which the, quote, lever is applied, on which the leverage is used until the day when they recognize the blessings of the, quote, possibility offered them in the Soviet system and the faithful guardianship of their, quote, most reliable leaders, end quote, and catch up with what was formerly the advanced detachment. Like a dedicated mother, the advanced detachment in the Soviet system sews the shirt and waits, patiently or otherwise, until the child can wear it. As long as this is not the case, the mother remains a mother and the shirt a shirt. The advanced detachment and the Soviet system, the Soviet system. Do we do Lenin an injustice with this depiction? I do not think so. He is a coherent man who has remained one and the same for decades, and what, 20 years ago, was the object of a purely literary controversy between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, what appeared at that time in the confined context of a struggle over organizational form, has today to submit to a test on the great scale of world history. The greatest revolutionary movement in the world history has decided on the Lenin-Luxemburg controversy of 1904, in which the standpoint of each side can be seen in the following lines from Rosa Luxemburg, quote, from the standpoint of the formal tasks of social democracy as a party of struggle, it appears from the outset that the party's battle readiness and the party's energy are directly dependent on the realization of centralism in the party's organization. But in this context, the specific historical conditions of the proletariat struggle are far more important than the standpoints of the formal requirements of any organization of struggle. The social democratic movement is the first movement in the history of class societies to be premised in its very aspect and in its whole development on the organization and the independent direct action of the masses. In this sense, social democracy creates a completely different type of organization from the earlier socialist movements, e.g. those of the Jacobin Blancist type. It appears that Lenin underestimates this when Lenin writes in his book that the revolutionary social democrat is really nothing but, quote, the Jacobin indissoluble link to the organization of the class-conscious proletariat. The organization of the class-conscious proletariat, end quote. Lenin, one step forward, two steps back. It is in the organization and class consciousness of the proletariat, as opposed to the conspiracy of a small minority, that Lenin sees the exhaustive distinctions between social democracy and Blanchism. Lenin forgets that this implies a complete reappraisal of our organizational concepts, a completely new concept of centralism, a completely new notion of the mutual relationship between organization and struggle. Blanchism was not premised on a direct class activity of the masses and did not therefore require a mass organization. On the contrary, as the broad popular masses were supposed to emerge into the battlefield only at the actual moment of revolution, while the preliminary activity consisted in the preparation of a revolutionary coup by a small minority, a rigid distinction between the people appointed to this specific task and the popular mass was directly necessary for the success of their mission. But it was also possible and attainable because there was no inherent connection between the conspiratorial activity of the Blankist organization and the everyday life of the popular mass. At the same time, both the tactics and the precise tasks of activity were worked out in advance in the minutest detail, determined and prescribed as a definite plan, because they are improvised off the cuff and at will, with no connection with the elemental class struggle. As a result, the active members of the organization were naturally transformed into the purely executive organs of a will that had been predetermined outside their own field of activity, into the instruments of a central committee. This also gave rise to the second characteristic of conspiratorial centrism, the absolute blind submission of the individual organs of the party to their central authority and the extension of the latter's powers right to the very periphery of the party organization. The conditions for social democratic activity are radically different. This derives historically from the elemental class struggle. It operates within the dialectical contradiction that here it is only in the struggle itself that the proletarian army is itself recruited, and only in the struggle that it becomes conscious of the purpose of the struggle. Organization, enlightenment, and struggle are not here separate moments, mechanically divided in time, as in a Blankist movement. They are merely different facets of the same process. On the one hand, apart from the general basic principles of struggle, there is no ready-made, predetermined, and detailed tactic of struggle that the Central Committee could drill into the Social Democratic membership. On the other hand, the process of struggle that creates the organization stipulates a constant fluctuation in the sphere of influence of social democracy. From this it follows that social democratic centralization cannot be based either on blind obedience or on the mechanical submission of the party's militants to their central authority, and further, that an impenetrable wall can never be erected between the nucleus of the class-conscious proletariat that is already organized into tightly knit party cadres and those in the surrounding stratum who have already been caught up in the class struggle and are in the process of developing class consciousness. The establishment of centralization in social democracy on these two principles, on the blind submission of all party organizations and their activity down to the smallest detail to a central authority that alone thinks, acts, and decides for everyone, and also on the strict separation of the organized nucleus of the party from its surrounding revolutionary milieu, as Lenin advocates. Therefore, it seems to us to be a mechanical transposition of the organizational principles of the Blankist movement of conspiratorial circles in the social democratic movement of the working masses. And Lenin characterizes this point of view perhaps more astutely than any of Lenin's opponents could when Lenin defines his, quote, revolutionary social democrat, end quote, as a, quote, Jacobin linked to the organization of the class-conscious workers, end quote. In fact, however, social democracy is not linked to the organization of the working class. Social democracy is the working class's own movement. Social democratic centralism must therefore have an essentially different character from Blankist centralism. It can be none other than the authoritative expression of the will of the conscious and militant vanguard, Vorhut, of the workers, vis-a-vis the separate groups and the individuals among them. It is, as it were, a, quote, self-centralism, end quote, of the leading stratum of the proletariat, the rule of its majority within the confines of its own party organization, end quote. Luxemburg, Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy. We are today in a position, on the basis of the experience of the Russian Revolution, to draw the practical lessons from this literary controversy. But before we do so, we would like, first of all, to deal to a certain extent with the forms that Lenin's conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat has led to. New section. Section 5. We have seen how the Soviet government is a form of state that was established in Russia following the smashing of the Russian feudal form of state by the victorious proletariat. Not much has yet been said beyond the form of state in itself and the, quote, possibility it gives for the broad proletarian masses to take part in the life of the state. The question is rather whether various, quote, forms of government, end quote, are also possible within this, quote, form of state, end quote. Just as the state form of the bourgeoisie is conceivable with a very varied range of forms of government, parenthesis, republic, monarchy, parliamentarism, etc., end parenthesis. Without, parenthesis, as far as we know, end parenthesis, Lenin having investigated and replied to this question, it would seem from various statements of Lenin's that his answer is an affirmative one. For a start, the masses and their participation in the Soviet system are for Lenin only a, quote, possibility. A possibility, however, is not a solid basis on which a state can be built. The firm wall that supports the Soviet edifice is the advanced detachment of the proletariat, i.e. the Communist Party, and in the first stage of the revolution in any case, the Bolsheviks, also quite rightly at the start, reckoned that the front rank, i.e. the industrial proletariat, would also take an active part in it. But, because the participation of the majority is only a possibility, which gives the industrial proletariat no security, relations between the only fixed point, the advanced detachment on the one hand, and the front rank and the majority on the other must be variable. Lenin says about this, quote, dictatorship does not necessarily mean the abolition of democracy for the class that exercises the dictatorship over the other classes. But dictatorship does mean the abolition, parenthesis, or very material restriction, which is also a form of abolition, end parenthesis, of democracy for the class over which or against which the dictatorship is exercised, end quote. Lenin, the Proletarian Revolution, and the Renegade Kautsky. It follows from this that the form of government under the Soviet system can initially vary through a greater or lesser degree of democracy vis-a-vis both the dictating and the, quote, dictated class. Abolition of democracy for the bourgeoisie is necessary, but the degree is not determined. At all events, quote, the question of depriving the exploiters of the franchise is, bracket, a purely Russian question, end bracket, and not a question of the dictatorship of the proletariat in general, end quote. Lenin, the Proletarian Revolution, and the Renegade Kautsky. Quote, it would be a mistake, however, to guarantee in advance that the impending proletarian revolutions in Europe will all, or the majority of them, be necessarily accompanied by restriction of the franchise for the bourgeoisie. It may be so. After the war and the experience of the Russian Revolution, it probably will be so, but it is not absolutely necessary for the exercise of the dictatorship. It is not an indispensable characteristic of the logical concept, quote, dictatorship. It does not enter as an indispensable condition in the historical and class concept, quote, dictatorship, end quote, end quote. As we shall go on to see, Lenin, the Proletarian Revolution, and the Renegade Kautsky. We shall go on to see that Rosa Luxemburg did not represent this point of view, and what were her reasons for this. Here, we would just like to emphasize that, according to Lenin's doctrine, the dictatorship of the proletariat does not have to mean, quote, completely an abolition of democracy for the ruling, parenthesis, proletarian, and parenthesis, class. The general rule, however, that results from this conception will be the abolition of democracy also for the proletarian class. What we then have is a great ego that reigns over all, that hands out a tolerable measure of democracy, not too little, not too much, to the, quote, ruling as well as to the ruled class. This, quote, single one, who can say of himself, quote, that he alone holds in his hands the fullness of all right, and allots the several peoples according to his sight. End quote. That's from Holderlin's poem, The Unique One. We have already indicated above the role that falls to the Communist Party, the advanced attachment in this connection, but this does not exhaust all the possibilities. For perhaps the Communist Party itself falls into that unbound realm of, quote, possibilities. Lenin thinks along just these lines, quote, there is, therefore, absolutely no contradiction in principle between Soviet, that is, socialist, democracy, and the exercise of dictatorial powers by individuals. The difference between proletarian dictatorship and bourgeois dictatorship is that the proletarian dictatorship strikes at the exploiting minority in the interest of the exploited majority, and that it is exercised also through individuals, not only by the working and exploited people, but also by organizations which are built in such a way as to rouse these people to history-making activity. The Soviet organizations or organizations of this kind, end quote. Lenin, the immediate tasks of the Soviet government. With this, the dictatorship of the proletariat is placed on a completely new footing. Democracy or no democracy, party or no party, advanced attachment or no advanced attachment, one individual or several, all this is compatible with the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is characterized by two aspects, a subjective and an objective aspect. The subjective aspect, that the dictator dictates, quote, in the interests of the exploited majority, end quote. The objective moment, quote, that it is exercised, not only by the working and exploited people, but also by organizations which are built in such a way as to rouse these people, end quote. From only a brief indication of how Rosa Luxemburg's views on this subject were quite the contrary, we can thus maintain that, even under the Soviet system, i.e. the form of state specific to proletarian dictatorship, the most varied forms of government are conceivable. From free democracy under circumstances even for the bourgeoisie, through to the strict dictatorship of an individual. It goes without saying that in this system, compulsion plays a considerable role, for all mechanics ultimately is based on the application and expression of forces, and it also goes without saying that force accordingly plays force's role, right up to its most extreme forms in terrorism. I do not intend here to go into the forms in which compulsion is expressed in Russia, but confine myself to a few remarks on Germany. We can happily admit that the use of the sharpest means, even terroristic means, is a necessity for those struggling for their lives, as the Bolsheviks often did, and has to be recognized as such even by those who do not see it as the finest blossoming in the development of state power. In Europe and Germany, however, terrorism has, in places, been made into a true religion, and there are communists who see the characteristic sign of this in a daily sacrifice on the altar of Huitzolopochtli. What the hell is that? Huitzilopouchli. Huitzilopouchtli is the name of an Aztec deity who served a dual purpose as the god of war and god of the sun. His name translates out to, quote, resuscitated warrior of the South, end quote. Depending on the circumstances and context, he was also called Shri Pili, meaning turquoise prince, or Totek, which simply meant, quote, our Lord. Back to the text. We need not conceal from ourselves that this glorification of terrorism is nothing at all but a sign of great weakness combined with the consciousness of this weakness. The boy who is wrongly beaten by a bigger boy spends days wallowing in images of the bloody revenge he will take, quote, as soon as, ... end quote. We cannot even see an advance in the revolutionary will of the working classes when fantasies of this kind are deliberately given new fuel, and we believe it is only doing a service to the revolutionary movement to oppose such childishness clearly and unambiguously. Rosa Luxemburg had no time for this, quote, redskin romanticism. Luxemburg also clearly expressed her view on terrorism, and it is no accident the program of the Spartacus League contains simply and sensibly the following words, quote, the proletarian revolution requires no terror for its aims. It hates and despises killing, end quote. Luxemburg. Any well-informed person knows what she had in mind. New section, section 6. We can now turn to the question that we left above. What are the practical results of Lenin's view, as this was sketched out in the quotation from Rosa Luxemburg? We have to go back to February of last year, which saw a fundamental change in the Soviet Republic in this connection. We have already seen above how in that month the Bolsheviks' view of how to resolve the peasant question took a different tack from their previous conception, and now they had to put their relationship to the peasantry on a new basis. The same month, however, the Bolsheviks also found themselves forced to take a new look at their relationship to the proletariat. The story that a few, quote, well-informed people are retailing in Germany, that the Kronstadt uprising was the work of Tsarist officers with French money or of a few Mensheviks, is extremely naive. It may well be that some Tsarist generals were at work behind the Kronstadt sailors. We do not know. It may well be that, quote, Menshevik slogans played a role in the Kronstadt uprising. We do not know. But there is one thing that we do know for sure, which is that neither Tsarist generals nor French money nor Menshevik slogans are sufficient explanation of how it was possible that the most loyal sons of the revolution, the most devoted supporters of the Bolsheviks, who had so long been the elite of revolutionary fighters, proven in 100 battles, rose up against those whom they formerly supported. This fact can only be explained by a profound crisis within the proletariat itself, a serious conflict that has arisen between the, quote, advanced detachment, end quote, and the, quote, front rank, perhaps indeed within the, quote, advanced detachment itself. We would have evidence of this if the Kronstadt uprising we would have evidence for this even if the Kronstadt uprising had not been a visible indication. I would like to offer here some quotations from those days, all taken from Russische Correspondence, Year 2, Numbers 3 and 4. Karl Radek writes, quote, most of the remaining workers, in these particularly difficult moments, saw the communists as slave drivers, demanding ever new sacrifices from them. This gave rise to a tension between a section of non-communist workers and the Communist Party and Soviet government. One of the most important tasks of the Communist Party in the present situation is to reduce right away this gap between the vanguard and the rear, or indeed to reconcile it, end quote. Karl Radek. A draft resolution published in the same issue, quote, among these unhealthy phenomena are the bureaucratization of the leading party apparatus and the lack of a functioning systematic connection with the mass of party members, as well as the visible tendency to divide the party into upper and lower strata, workers and intellectuals, or to reduce the role of the party. These phenomena together prepare the ground for syndicalist deviations that endanger party unity." End quote. From the draft theses presented by a group of active functionaries, quote, "With the purpose of drawing broad masses of the party into questions of party life, raising their level of understanding, developing their initiative and autonomy, the system of detailed and open discussion must be made into a principle, in the party press as well as in party meetings, so that all tendencies and groups within the party are offered the full opportunity of making their position known. In order to be able to attract the advanced strata of the proletariat, organized in our party for the sake of building it up, to establish direct connection with the masses and cleanse the leading party organs, parenthesis, central committee, government committees, etc., in parenthesis, these organs must consist of at least 2/3 workers," end quote. This means the following. At the same time as the Bolsheviks had reached a critical stage in connection with their relationship with the peasantry, there was trouble among the industrial proletariat itself. The cause of this was quite simple. The distance between the Communist Party and the broad mass had grown so great that the party threatened to suffocate from it. Quote, "The party," end quote, Zinoviev complains, quote, "in a certain sense lacks oxygen. This oxygen is the non-party masses," end quote, Zinoviev. This was the central problem for the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. We have already explained elsewhere how all the debates of this Congress were dominated by the attempt to solve this problem by organizational methods, and we can only judge the positive and negative aspects of these attempts after learning their intention and methods from the following explanations. The theses adopted by the Congress state, quote, "The Communist Party of Russia has to realize the dictatorship of the proletariat in a country in which the peasants form the great majority of the population. Now that the peasants are no longer threatened by a restoration of landed property, the realization of the dictatorship of the proletariat comes up against new difficulties. A successful realization of this proletarian dictatorship is only possible in the presence of powerful trade unions and mass organizations, solid in their will and effort, which are open to all proletarians at the different stages of development of their class consciousness." End quote. I would like to recall here the words of Lenin quoted above, that the dictatorship of the proletariat is characterized by the fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat strikes its blows in the interests of the exploited, and the further fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat's measures are carried out through the organizations that are in a position to arouse the broad masses and raise the broad masses to historic creation. At that time, the Soviets were characterized as organizations of this kind. It is quite clear that this task is now ascribed to the trade unions. This means, on the negative side, that the Soviets have played out their role. The Soviets are shattered because the classes that the Soviets formerly brought together in unity, peasants and workers, no longer have anything in common. The new organs that the dictatorship seeks for itself are organizations of the industrial proletariat. The organizational basis of the dictatorship has narrowed. It is only still supported, parenthesis, in theory, end parenthesis, on what was previously the front rank, and is bending its practical efforts to bring this front rank, which is already almost lost, up to the advanced detachment. Quote, "We overlooked," says Zinoviev, quote, "that a turning point was approaching that was leading us into a general crisis, and that the trade unions will function as the most important lever, ! In leading us out of it, in helping the party to overcome the crisis," end quote. And 2 pages later, following Zinoviev's complaint about the lack of oxygen, Zinoviev says, quote, "The trade unions form to a certain degree such a reserve of oxygen," end quote. Zinoviev. If this already demonstrates how even the state form of Soviet Republic and the possibilities the state form of Soviet Republic offers provide no guarantee to the class content of the Soviet Republic, and that under the roof of the Soviet Republic, and not only of the bourgeois republic, the class content can alter. The following presentation will offer definite proof of this. New section. Section 7. In February 1921, the situation of the Bolsheviks was as follows. They had lost the support of the proletariat, as is shown by the debates at their 10th Party Congress. They had lost the poor peasants who had been their former support among the peasantry. These had all become middle peasants and opponents of any communist policy. The onslaught was coming from both sides, from the proletariat in Kronstadt and from the threat of peasant uprisings. The Bolsheviks, in fact, lacked a class basis and held out due to the force of their organization, a force that cannot hold out for long. The Bolsheviks were forced to quickly decide for one class or the other. At this point in time, they stayed with the stronger battalions, i.e., they started by pacifying the peasants. There is no need to list here the whole chain of concessions that have been made to the peasants since February this year. The tax in kind in place of the grain monopoly, the introduction of free trade, the restoration of private enterprise. They are now seeking to rebuild the entire edifice that they themselves demolished 3 years ago. It is not only in economics that the Bolsheviks are abandoning their old goals. They are also doing this in their ideas. Lenin writes, quote, "It is not directly by way of enthusiasm, but with the aid of personal interest, personal self-interest, with the help of economic calculation, that we shall build a firm bridge that will lead via state capitalism to socialism in a small peasant country, ... end quote." This, of course, sounds, end quote, Lenin. This, of course, sounds quite different from what Lenin said, for example, in 1918. Quote, "Without the guidance of experts in the various fields of knowledge, technology, and experience, the transition to socialism will be impossible. Because socialism calls for a conscious mass advance to greater productivity of labor compared with capitalism, and on the basis achieved by capitalism, socialism must achieve this advance in socialism's own way, by socialism's own methods, or, to put it more concretely, by Soviet methods." End quote. Lenin, the immediate tasks of the Soviet government. And it sounds quite different from what Lenin said in 1919, quote, "As well as this, the proletariat must go ahead of the whole mass of working and exploited people, as well as all petty bourgeois strata, in initiating this new economic construction by creating a new social content, a new labor discipline, a new organization of labor, which realizes both the latest results of science and capitalist technology and carries through the mass cooperation of goal-conscious workers in socialist mass production." End quote. Lenin. These are, of course, the tones that led Lloyd George to say with biting irony early in These are, of course, the tones that led Lloyd George to say with bitter irony early in 1921, quote, "My honorable friend Mr. Winston Churchill would also have spoken in these terms." End quote. We can say with certainty in these circumstances what, in the light of this policy, will come of the other attempt to build a base among the workers by the organizational, quote, lever of the trade unions. Zinoviev, I believe, already anticipated this when he said, though in a different connection, quote, "If this policy of concessions becomes a fact and thousands of workers are employed in the concession enterprises, will the trade unions not also have their particular tasks to fulfill?" End quote. Zinoviev. It is incontestably true. This is incontestably true, and we come directly to the point if we take this line of thought to its conclusion. Quote, the concessionaire, Lenin says, is, quote, a capitalist. The concessionaire conducts his business on capitalist lines for profit, ... end quote. What is the task of the trade unions? Is their task to say, quote, work for the capitalist who makes high profits, but thanks to these high profits, the basis will be laid on which one day our government can introduce communism, end quote. Or should they say to the worker, quote, don't work for the capitalists and their profit, cut back their profit, capitalism is hell, end quote. They can say one thing or the other. In the first case, the trade unions become an accessory to the capitalists. In the second case, the trade unions will come into conflict with the capitalists. The concessionaires will summon help from those that gave them the concessions. And then? No, we have to face the facts. There are two classes in Russia that are irreconcilable. On the one hand, the peasant capitalist class, with the industrial and merchant capitalist temporarily on its shoulders. On the other hand, the proletariat. There is just as little prospect in Russia of an armistice or reconciliation in the class struggle imminent in society as there is anywhere else. And the party that seeks to reconcile, that seeks to give capitalism what is capitalism's and to the proletariat what is the proletariat's, will be the first to be shattered in this struggle. The Bolsheviks are seeking to give to capitalism for now, in order to save the proletariat for the future. What the proletariat has to save for the proletariat's future, however, cannot be given to it by a party. No Santa Claus can place it on the Christmas tree. The proletariat will conquer its future by the proletariat's own struggle, in which it grows and strengthens itself, and the party that strikes it for the sake of the present moment disarms it for the future. Quote, the working class is only to set free the elements of a new society that are developing the womb of the collapsing bourgeois society, end quote. That is Marx's formulation of the task of the victorious proletariat. We need no one to tell us that the Russian concessionaires with their surplus profit, the Russian hucksters and speculators whose emergence no one can now prevent, are, quote, elements of a new society, end quote. Or that it is for the sake of, quote, setting them free, end quote, that the Russian workers have made such great sacrifices. What then is left of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote? Nothing. Nothing of the dictatorship of the proletariat's objective aspects. Nothing of the dictatorship of the proletariat's subjective aspects. The Russian concessionaires are not measures to be, quote, realized by the masses of workers and exploited, end quote, except as the objects of exploitation. But what about the subjective aspects? This is what the whole present line of argument of the Bolsheviks seems to depend on, for it is still the Bolshevik party that stands at the head of the Russian Soviet Republic, the party that has done more than any other for the world proletariat, for the world revolution. There still stand at its head men with such unimpugnable judgment, devotion and fidelity to the proletarian cause as Lenin and Trotsky. On the day that altered circumstances permit, they will be the first to put an end to all concessions to capitalism, which are just as distasteful to Lenin and Trotsky as to anyone else. All this is true. We need only raise one objection. Lenin and Trotsky could die. Who will be their successors? For one thing is certain. All the old communists who witnessed the growth and development of the Bolshevik party may be firm and unshakable. But in the big party of today, they are only a small proportion. And the great mass of the party? Here we come to the most profound mistake in Lenin's argument. The idea that you can seal off a party, nurture a party like a culture in a laboratory, preserve a party unaltered, even improve the party by one, quote, purge after another, that you can erect a dividing wall between the party and the broad masses who are part of the process. The party is a part of social being, and a party that carries out this policy of concessions for only a few years will reflect the spirit of this policy, not that of revolution. And so, we return to the question from which we started out. The Soviet system is not a recipe that guarantees always and in all circumstances the character of developing proletarian power. It is only the most favorable form in which the proletariat continues its class struggle. If the proletariat abandons class struggle, even in the Soviet Union, then the forces of its enemies grow stronger. Even under the Soviet system, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, or of the peasants, can erect itself over the proletariat. And should we wait to continue the struggle for the proletariat for the day when it is possible? I am afraid that Bolshevik policy is postponing such a day until the distant future. Section 8. Before we go into any more detail on this point, I would like to sketch Rosa Luxemburg's position on the question, as can be seen quite evidently from her whole position in the present text. I believe that the profound opposition between the Bolsheviks and Rosa Luxemburg cannot be made any clearer than by pointing out the following. For the Bolsheviks, the proletarian revolution is a process that takes place with a system of advanced detachment, front rank, and mass. The advanced detachment makes use of the, quote, lever, needs the, quote, oxygen reserve, pulls, quote, forward. A system, in short, in which the higher circle acts with mechanical means on the lower. Nothing is more characteristic than this. When, in early 1921, the Bolsheviks lost their connection with the proletarian masses, which the Soviet system had previously produced, the Bolsheviks pondered as to a form of organization and decided that the trade unions would now be the, quote, lever. What was Rosa Luxemburg's view of the development of the socialist social order? She says, quote, the socialist system of society should only be, and can only be, a historical product born out of the school of its own experiences, born in the course of its realization, as a result of the developments of living history, just like organic nature of which, in the last analysis, it forms a part, ... end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. At the bottom of her consistent soul, Rosa Luxemburg knew no divisions and walls. For Luxemburg, the universe was a living process of becoming, in which leverage and oxygen reserves cannot replace the workings of nature, in which the struggle, striving, and contention of human beings, the great struggle that is incumbent on individuals, generations, strata, and classes, is the form of becoming. This did not mean Luxemburg did not want people to struggle because everything happens of itself. Rather, Luxemburg wanted the most active struggle, since this is the most active form of becoming. Rosa Luxemburg's judgment of Bolshevik policy follows directly from this basic attitude of hers. She was a democratic church mouse was Luxemburg a democratic church mouse who did not want a hair of anyone's head to be touched unless by legal authority? Certainly not. Luxemburg knew how to wage struggle as struggle, war as war, civil war as civil war. But Luxemburg could only conceive of civil war as a free play of forces, in which even the bourgeoisie was not forced into cellars by police measures, because it is only through open struggle that the masses can grow and recognize the magnitude and difficulty of their struggle. Luxemburg did not seek the annihilation of the bourgeoisie by savage terrorism, by the monotonous work of the executioner, any more than the hunter seeks to annihilate the prey in his wood. It is in struggle that the game grows stronger and larger. For Luxemburg, the annihilation of the bourgeoisie, which Luxemburg also wanted, would be the result of the social transformation of the revolution. If combating the bourgeoisie in a police fashion was already alien to Luxemburg's point of view, There can be no doubt that Luxemburg would have judged such measures against sections of the there can be no doubt how Luxemburg would have judged such measures against sections of the proletariat. Certainly, Luxemburg took every kind of reformism to be an error, a serious diversion for the working class. Luxemburg fought reformism wherever she could. In Germany, Luxemburg was the creator and leader of the struggle against reformism. In the work published here, Luxemburg likewise sharply fought reformism. But in the last analysis, this entire struggle is summed up already in the words with which Luxemburg concluded her article in Neue Zeit in 1904, quote, "The mistakes that are made by a truly revolutionary workers' movement are, historically speaking, immeasurably more fruitful and more valuable than the infallibility of the best possible, quote, central committee," end quote, end quote. Luxemburg. Organizational questions of Russian social democracy. It is true that the Menshevik workers made mistakes in Russia. We certainly believe that they did not understand the lofty task of the year 1917 and that subsequently they often vacillated. But no one can contest the fact that despite the burdens of these mistakes, they were part of the great revolutionary mass of workers who stood in 1917 against the Tsar, in 1917 against the Tsar, in 1918 against the Czechoslovaks, in 1919 against Kolchak and Udenich, and in 1920 against Wrangel. They made mistakes. Perhaps some of them took steps that were incompatible with the existence of the Soviet Republic. These had to be punished. That is the law of life for all states. But to banish parties, as tendencies, from the surface by police measures, to remove them from the light of day, was for Rosa Luxemburg an impossible idea, not for the sake of the reformists, but for that of the revolution and the revolutionaries themselves, who can also triumph inwardly only if they combat mistakes freely. For the experience that revolutionaries gain from the struggle against reformism cannot be replaced by any leader, police force, or Cheka. They have to gain this experience in their own struggle. We believe that these underlying ideas, which already lay at the root of the debate between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg in 1904, have now faced each other on a gigantic scale, have been tested by the history of the Russian Revolution. We believe that Rosa Luxemburg, on the basis of this idea of hers, saw with prophetic eyes the rocks on which the ship of the Soviet Republic has now suffered such heavy weight. We have already indicated the critique that Luxemburg made of the Bolsheviks' land policy. Quote, "It piles up insurmountable obstacles to the socialist transformation of agrarian relations," end quote. Quote, "The Leninist agrarian reform has created a new and powerful layer of popular enemies of socialism in the countryside, enemies whose resistance will be much more dangerous and stubborn than that of the noble large landowners," end quote. Luxemburg, the Russian Revolution. We have seen how this happened. The effects are certainly even more serious than Luxemburg foresaw. Luxemburg had in mind the resistance that the peasants would put up to the transformation of agrarian relations. The way things have turned out, though, the peasants are in a position to reverse the transformation of industrial relations. Here, we believe, lies a second mistake that Rosa Luxemburg found fault with, in which Luxemburg was still more eager and passionate to pursue than the first one. Quote, "With the repression of political life in the land as a whole, life in the Soviets must also become more and more crippled. Without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of the press and assembly, without a free struggle of opinion, life dies out in every public institution, becomes a mere semblance of life in which only the bureaucracy remains as the active element." End quote. Luxemburg, the Russian Revolution. We have seen how in 1921, when the great push forward of the peasants came, a struggle that the Bolsheviks themselves had long seen coming. They were precisely concerned to re-establish life among the working masses. The Soviets were dead. They no longer formed even the mechanical connection between advanced detachment, front rank, and mass. Still less did they form that great totality that Trotsky speaks of, in which, quote, the movement takes charge of itself as a whole, end quote. They were burnt out cinders, and the trade unions are now to be their emergency replacement, since they are the only organization in which there are still large masses of, quote, non-party workers. Non-party? Is there a more serious reproach than that in the Russian proletariat? Which since 1905 stood as a shining model for proletarians everywhere, and will remain so for all time, there are, after 4 years of proletarian rule, an overwhelming mass of, quote, non-party workers. Have these really remained uninterested? Do they stand indifferent with lowered heads when their life is at stake, which they have so often won on the battlefield? Have they become indifferent, or are they shy of saying what they think? Do they guard their tongues, or has the revolution become obnoxious to them, so that they are, quote, non-party? Is not each one of them a living reproach? However that may be, the Russian Revolution and its leading party have not been able to connect these masses with the fate of the revolution. They stand aside, not in the ranks of the fighters. Public life is dead. The spirit of democracy, which alone forms the breath of the masses, is dead. A rigidly centralized party, a splendid central committee, a wretched bureaucracy move over the waters. Below, all is waste and empty, and so the pressure from the peasants did not encounter a strong, lively, vigorous, enthusiastic proletariat. It found a vanguard that had no majority behind it, and this determined the fate of the vanguard. Dictatorship of the proletariat. Quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Now we can see what this is. It is not something that happens in broad regions of social philosophy. Dictatorship of the proletariat is not a patented form of state that contains a secret pattern within it. Dictatorship of the proletariat is the state power that has been conquered so long as the will, the force, the enthusiasm, the confidence in victory of the proletarian class stand behind it. Dictatorship of the proletariat is at the same time a condition and a form of state, the one expressed in the other. Dictatorship of the proletariat is kernel and shell at the same time, and where the kernel and shell vanish, the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, is at an end. The invigorating air of the prospect of victory and of the will of the proletarian class would thus, we believe, have made it possible to avoid many of the obstacles that have inflicted such bloody wounds on the Russian Revolution. For in the final analysis, the life of a great people consists not only in arithmetical magnitudes and in forces to be calculated mechanically. How did it happen? If it is permissible to compare small things with great, then on 10th of November 1918, when the German working class was without an organization and could show only the sadly withered beginnings of a future organization, the Erich Ludendorff was forced to become Erich Lindström. Crown Prince Ruprecht fled to the protection of the Spanish embassy, and the Kreuz Zeitung moved the Prussian cuckoo from its masthead, whereas 3 years later, under a, quote, well-ordered republic, end quote, Erich Lindström again became Erich Ludendorff and savior of his fatherland. Ruprecht had gone from Spanish to German again and was pretender to the throne, and the Kreuz Zeitung again stood, quote, with God for king and fatherland, end quote. Not simply because the German Republic cannot do what it does not even want to, but because it does not have and cannot have that victorious revolutionary, quote, authority which even the lamentable German Revolution possessed in its first beginnings, and which chased its enemies into their hiding places by force of this, quote, authority. This is the, quote, horror of revolution, end quote. But where this powerful force of the class evaporates, in time the substitutes must also fail. Concessions on the one hand, organization on the other, and police measures in both directions. These things do not just have measure and number. There is a spirit that must prevail over everything, and only the proletarian revolution can raise this to the historical and moral magnitude in with which it can accomplish its great task. Section 9. Anyone who writes in these terms writes a piece of their own heart. For time and again, the great tragedy of the Russian Revolution is that, in the last analysis, all its mistakes and all its errors were possible only because it saw itself as the first link in the great world struggle, and because the world proletariat left it in the lurch. And yet we believe that reproaches are not enough. It is rather a duty to see things as they are. We cannot, quote, make the, quote, world revolution in Europe, not with our own forces and not with friendly support. It was precisely as Rosa Luxemburg stressed, the great wager of Bolshevik policy in its first phase, that they put such great store on the, quote, readiness for action of the proletariat, the force of the masses, the whole will to power of socialism, end quote. Not only was this the intention of Bolshevik policy, it was also in fact the fruit of this policy. No previous event in the world took hold of the minds of millions of proletarians. No act ever gave wings to the development and rise of the proletariat, as Soviet Russia did by the very fact that it existed, by the fact that it maintained itself, by the fact that despite all its actual or supposed errors, all party criticism and contention, the proletarians recognized its burning and unquenchable will to the victory of the world proletariat. It cannot be contested that this development has been interrupted because of reasons that are only partly to be sought within Russia. It cannot be contested that this development has been interrupted because of reasons that are only partly to be sought in Russia. But precisely this situation, extremely difficult and critical for the workers' movement of every country and for every workers' party, requires double attention in a place from where great benefit and great harm can proceed. We will not immerse ourselves in details here, but simply take one example. German capitalism is encroaching on the railway companies. With the rise in social and political antagonism in Germany, who knows at what point great social battles may erupt? Perhaps on the railways. All the organizations of railway men have declared themselves ready to use any means necessary. The basic question may be that of private capitalism or private ownership. But what should the German workers respond to Stinnes if Stinnes reads them Lenin's article in Rotofana which says, quote, personal interest increases production, end quote. Lenin. The Russian Revolution remains a valuable treasure for all workers, as they recognize in it, even if they see mistakes, the clearest, most determined, and most unambiguous representation of proletarian being and proletarian future. The Russian Revolution would no longer be able to play this role if it lost this feeling among the workers. The Bolsheviks have one thing in their possession, the greatest moral asset that the working class has ever assembled. No one who went through the years 1918, 1919, and 1920 will contest this. We have already lamented elsewhere how this asset was, in part, uselessly squandered, in a way that can never be restored. If we are to be totally lost, there may be people who would take this with an easy heart. We believe that the workers of the whole world would be spiritually impoverished, and that it might take the work of decades to rebuild what existed in 1918. That's the end. Thank you for listening.